When Tracy proposed this, I said, do we really want to do 8:30, 30 miles from where most people live? And she said, Peter Bauer could draw a crowd at midnight, 60 miles from where people live, and he has. So, welcome to what we hope is the first in an important ongoing series of coverage of the critical issues for the park that we all love so much. And I want to begin by recognizing our founder, extraordinary, Dick Beamish, whose critique of the current edition arrived for me before the edition arrived. And I want you to know Dick is as concerned about the Explorer and the Adirondacks as much as he ever has been, but we were special to have him as our founder and our leader, and his legacy is extraordinary. And my name is Tom Curley. I'm the board chair, and I am pleased to welcome you all to this, and my role is to turn it over to Tracy, and but I want to say that the viability of the Adirondack communities is critical. We know that, and how to do that, the steps that we take are really the key pieces of what we're going to talk about going forward. So without further ado, let me bring on our great publisher, Tracy Ormsby. Tracy?
Before I talk about what we're going to be doing up here this morning, I just wanted to recognize the Adirondack Explorer board members who are in the audience today. Without this group of really smart, talented, and well-respected people, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. I don't know where you guys are at this point, but of course, Tom Curley and Adam Fetterman, Dick Beamish, our founder, Charlotte Hall, Lynn Pateau, Larry Master, who am I forgetting? I think that's everybody. We have the Adirondack Explorer's associate publisher, Betsy Dernberger, is in the house. Sarah Ruberg, the Explorer's intern, who's going to be writing about today's event, is right here. You guys should just wave. And Molly Ormsby is taking a video of today's event, and it'll be on our website later. And Michael Armstrong, our office manager, is doing everything else. So these, Peter and Adam, these two gentlemen, have been doing some really incredible research and putting it separately and putting it into two reports that will provide the kind of information about the park that we need to understand it and bring ideas and make decisions about what's going on here. So Peter Bauer is the executive director of Protect the Adirondacks, and he's been working on his report for several years, I think as long as I've known him. So it's finished this year, and he's been presenting it around the park this spring and summer, and it's generated some really important discussions. The report set out to disprove long-held beliefs that environmental protections, restrictions on land use, have negatively impacted Adirondack communities. The report looks at census data from 1970 to 2010. It's not new data, but it's being looked at in a new way. Rather than comparing the Adirondacks just to New York State and the nation, it's looking at similarly populated regions of rural America, and it looks at population generationally as groups moved in and out and sometimes back into the park. The data shows park towns and their 130,000 inhabitants mirror national trends in some economic categories while outperforming most small communities in others. So while Peter was mailing his report out this spring, Adam Fetterman, an investigative journalist, took on a project for the Adirondack Foundation, looking into deeply rooted challenges and promising opportunities in our communities related to social services, education, and economic development. He looked through data sets and interviewed more than 70 people for the report, which captures voices of people benefiting from assistance programs, brings attention to the sticky relationships between income, housing, education, childcare, transportation, and other factors that influence the health and safety and security of many in our communities. It also highlights innovative solutions with potential to serve as models for positive change. And Brandon Loomis, who will be marking his first year this month as Adirondack Explorer editor, will be bringing all of that together with his questions. So, Peter's going to go first and present his findings, and then Brandon will ask the two of them questions, and then we'll open it up for a discussion with all of you. So, Peter, you want to get us started?
Sure. Do I need the microphone?
Maybe not.
Do I need the microphone? Can people hear me? No? Okay. Great. So I'm going to race through a longer presentation that I've given a few times today, but just a couple things. My name is Peter Bauer, Executive Director with Protect the Adirondacks, environmental nonprofit here in the park, engaged in a lot of issues around private land regulation, around forest preserve management, around community development in the Adirondack Park. I have a couple of my board members, Nancy Bernstein, the great Nancy Bernstein is here, and Lorraine DeVos and Keene. Lorraine was on a committee of folks that helped to put this report together. I see a lot of members in the audience, and I see a lot of folks, if you're not members, you should be members. There's materials in the back. We have to make that pitch. Okay, so this report was a number of years in the making, and I have to credit our statistician, James Long, professional statistician, lives down in Canada Lake, town of Caroga. We started and stopped, and we started and stopped through a number of iterations with this report. Oftentimes because James would go run for public office. He's now on the town board in the town of Caroga, so heavily invested in that community. But let's just start with the next slide, please. All right, so the focus, what we really wanted to do, as Tracy talked about, was to look at Adirondack communities, not really to test whether or not environmental controls in the park have been good or whether they've been bad. Because we don't know that. We just wanted to see whether or not the experience of Adirondack communities over the last 40 years somehow stood out from other communities, other rural areas in other parts of the country. We thought that if there was something special, unique, different going on here, we would see it in the data, and that's what we were looking for. So what we were trying to do is, we've long felt that there had been a misdiagnosis of the challenges in the park in Albany and from local leaders. And we thought that, one of this was commonly, a blame the park attitudes. We really wanted to see, can we try and get somehow beyond this, not just in our rhetoric, but in our investments, in our practices, in the public debate about the future of the park. And if we could, we thought that, that may point the way forward because rural areas are struggling. So 1970 to 2010 is the point in time that we focused on. We did this for a couple of reasons. One, this is the era of the modern Adirondack Park. We all know our Adirondack Park history, but a lot of things happened after 1970. We had the creation of the APA Act in 71, the State Land Master Plan in 72, and the Land Use and Development Plan in 73. Unfortunately, the yellows don't show up, but what I like to say on these maps is, behind every color on this map is a body of law. Ask Art Lucy, ask John Ernst, the APA board members here, they'll tell you there's no easy things about any of these colors on the map. But when you look on the map on the right compared to the left, this has also been an era of significant land protection in the park. The brown are the conservation easements, the blues are the wilderness areas, the light green are the wild forest areas of the forest preserve. Over 1.1 million acres from in this period of time, from 73 to 2018, came into public protection. So that's significant. And a lot of work by a lot of organizations. How to study the Adirondack Park is always tricky. Because one of the issues is, we have this park that has 12 counties. Only 2 counties are 100% within the park, Essex and Hamilton. The other 10 counties are split by the blue line. When we look at park communities, there are 92 towns, 61 are 100% within the park, 31 are split by the blue line. How is it that you try and look at the park? When a lot of folks over the years have grabbed data from Essex County and Hamilton County, the 2 counties that are 100% within the park, And they said, these represent surrogates. This represents a good way to try and delve in to see what's going on in the park. The problem is there's only about less than a third of the park's estimated population of 130,000 people is here. What we did in this report is we grabbed all of the towns that are 100% within the park, and you're going to hear me talk about the park towns and the split towns. The park towns are those 61 towns, 100% within the park, about 100,000 people, about 77% of the estimated population of 130,000. We thought that was a much better surrogate to look at long-term trends facing the park. The split towns, the park towns are in blue, the split towns are in the light blue. And those are the 31 towns, a population of about 150,000 or so. On this map, we also talk about other rural areas in upstate New York. So we also wanted to compare other similar areas in the state and across the country. The first we selected was other towns in New York State that have a similar population density as our park towns. Our park towns have a population density of about 14 people per square mile. Great range, everything from Morehouse down on Route 8. If you're driving between Speculator and Utica, you pass through Morehouse, 0.45 people per square mile. Northampton, which has the village of Northville in it, 122 people per square mile, quite a range. So do that. Next, please. We also wanted to look at large geographic areas to try and come up with what is rural America. We settled on the USDA classification of what is rural America. The USDA classifies counties according to 12 different classification metrics according to their rural to urban continuum. We selected the most rural, which was the non-metropolitan in the rural counties. There's 1,941 counties spread across the U.S. That's our surrogate for rural America in this study. 45 million people, 15%, 14.9% of the country, but it occupies 68% of the landscape. So that's our substitute. In the Northeast, there are 80 counties, 4.3 million people of those rural counties in the Northeast. Next, we also looked at population density. There we get a smaller field, 1,333 counties. These are the counties that have a similar population density as the 61 park towns. Interestingly, we dropped to 6.4% of the population spread across 61% of the country. So the part of the U.S. that the Adirondacks occupies is part of that 61% of the continental U.S. with 6.4% of the population. So, we've heard some public rhetoric that we're full. We're all full up, nobody else can come here. There's a lot of open spaces right now. 15 counties that are kin to the Adirondacks in the Northeast that have a similar population density, about 456,000 people. Next, please. So here are the different indicators we looked at. One thing about census data, as Tracy mentioned, is that enabled us to do two things. That enabled us to get a long-term database where we could actually compare over 5 decennial censuses, 70, 80, 90, 2000, 2010. We could compare things like median household income and per capita income, adjusted for inflation, of course, but we could compare them from decade over decade, and that was important. The other thing that was important from 70 to 2010 is that we could get town-level data for New York State, which is really important because that's how we were able to aggregate the data for the 61 Adirondack Park communities to be able to compare the experiences and what was happening in those communities with other places. So that was very important. We did some really interesting things that we'll talk about as far as population, looking at age groups, ratio of children to adult to childbearing age. But it was this 40-year. We don't do anything with mid-census estimates. You're seeing stuff come out in the news now about the 2017 estimate and the 2018 estimate. We really just stuck to the 10-year decennial densities. That database is much more robust. There's tons more information than in the mid-decade estimates. That's what we stuck to. So I'm going to walk you through in-depthly what we did with one indicator, median household income, and how we treat each of the indicators in the report, but I'm not going to do this indicator after indicator because we'd be here for a while. and we have to race through a number of things. I really want to focus in on some of the population stuff in the time that I have. So these maps, you'll see a lot of these maps, and pick up the report. The maps up here, you know, the projectors does not do them justice. If you pick up the report, the maps are beautiful, the colors are really bright, and you can really see. So basically, when you see these maps on this slide and ones that follow, red means areas that performed worse than the 61 park towns. Everything we're doing in this report is how does the 61 park towns compare to other areas. Green are places that perform better than the Adirondack park towns for different measurements. The degree to which they're lighter or darker is the degree to which they're better or worse. And we do this for a national analysis, we do it for a statewide analysis, and then as we go through other slides, you'll see that we do this for a rural America and a Northeast analysis. We do this both for 1970 to 2010, as well as what we call a 2010 snapshot. How did we compare just in 2010? So major changes. Our first one, median household income. You look at the park towns, increased by 5.8% in that time period. The park towns grew, split towns by 10.4. Other places were flat. We've all heard this. You know, we've seen this in our national political debate. Flat wages. You really see it in the data for median household income. Flat wages in New York, flat wages across the country. Median's higher than the rural areas, both in the state and the country, but flat wages. Interestingly, this area saw some growth, and there's a lot of theories about why that is. We don't get into that, but we wanted to see how did this 5.8% growth over that 40-year time period for the 61 park towns compare with other areas. So, you know, we map it out. 1,575 places roughly were lower than that. 1,515 were higher than that across the country. The Adirondack park towns right in the middle. In the state, 529 worse, 375 better. Park towns doing better. We provide the data of the population there. This is what we do for indicator after indicator in the report. Next, please. We also then look at just rural America. So this is just the 1,941 towns. The one difference in this map from the other maps is any gray area on the map is a metropolitan county. So we're not measuring the 5.8% growth for median household income against the metropolitan areas. But we do look at the other rural areas. And we see that they were either they lost, they were flat, or the low density areas actually saw some growth. 1,333 counties, similar to the mark. So something was happening in the most rural of the rural areas across the country in this time period that, you know, both saw some growth. We look at the Adirondacks just compared to other rural areas, and in many ways, this is the most important comparison we make in the park. It's when we compare what's happening here to other rural areas. We see better in the 1,009, 930 better, pretty much right in the middle. And then in the Northeast, stronger in the Northeast. So we could talk about what was going on in the Northeast, but that's another matter. So then we flip next. Then we look at our 2010 snapshot. You know, our per capita income was $48,955 in 2010 for our 61 park towns. Again, that's adjusted for inflation. How did that compare with the country as a whole and the state as a whole? And you see that, you know, it's lower. That comparison, even though we had impressive growth, when we actually look at how that 48,955 stacks up, our median household, against the rest of the country or against the rest of the state, it's on the lower end. You know, 2/3 of the areas higher, roughly. When we look at rural America, the story changes. And here, you know, that 48,955 actually stacks up quite well against other rural areas in the country. Better than 1,641 of the rural counties, better than 56 of the rural counties in the Northeast, with big percentages as far as the total population of those areas, that the Adirondack communities had a higher population. So that's what we do for median household income, for per capita income, for the poverty rate, for employment rate, and for the self-employment rate. And rather than marching you all through these things, the story on the economic indicators largely for the Adirondack communities is they hold up very well economically. our numbers are very low. We're either solidly in the middle or we're up in the top third. So just really quickly, I wanted to settle on one area. You can go to the next, please. So this just provides, it just provides the raw numbers of those 4 slides that we went through, indicator through indicator. But you see, we're putting up numbers. This is places that we have a stronger performance than. So better than, in rural America, we're up in the 70s and 80s as far as counties and the population. That our per capita income level is better than in 2010, or our growth from 1970. Good, next please. Poverty rate, you can see again, we put up pretty good numbers in 2010, especially park towns, especially in rural America. There's a lot of other places that are a higher poverty rate than we do. Unemployment, next please. So you start to see we're, right in the middle with rural America, slightly down in other areas. This is the percent of people who are employed as part of the total population. The interesting thing is with the next one is self-employment rate. Something's going on in the parks, in our communities relative to self-employment. We have a much higher rate as far as the rate of growth. We're much higher than a lot of places. Than our 2010 level of self-employment was much higher. We had basically a 6.7% rate of self-employment in 2010. We grew by 52% over the last 40 years. So something's happening in the park that we think is worthy of investment, worthy of exploration relative to self-employment, and perhaps building a greater infrastructure to support it, because it has numbers that are very different. If you look in the report, self-employment has historically been much higher in rural areas than it has in metropolitan areas. The small family farm, all of the support businesses that support the family farm. It created this chain of small business and self-employment that historically was up. If you look from 1970 to 2010, major change, because the self-employment numbers are all negative for our major rural areas. For our low density and for rural America, they're negative, but yet they're positive here for the parks. So something, why we're having this significant change in the economy of rural America, there's something going on, and it's also in the Northeast, but there's something going on in the Adirondacks and the Northeast relative to self-employment that we think is something really to build upon in the future. So population, we're going to jump to next. So there are a couple things that I want to delve into here that we thought were really interesting, because again, this can be used as a guide to really tackle some of the challenges facing the park as far as the population, and potentially to zero in on some of the possible solutions. So 1970 to 2010, big era of change. The U.S. population grows by almost 52%. New York State grows by 6.2. We see big growth in the split towns. Think Queensbury. How big was Queensbury in that 40-year time period? Park grew by 10.6%. Moderate growth compared to other areas. When you look across the country, about 2/3 of the country grew at a higher rate than our 10.6 here amongst the park communities. Next, please. When you look at rural America, we're right in the middle. Our 10.6% growth, lower than a lot of other areas, but very similar to the low-density areas, to our kindred counties in the rural Northeast at 11.5. But solidly, and a few more grew by a higher rate than we did across rural America, but a number of places saw even higher losses. So we're solidly in the middle when it comes to our population trends. Let's go to the next one. When we just looked at 2000 to 2010 as to whether or not places were gaining or losing population. The interesting thing is about 1/3 of the counties across the country lost population from 2000 to 2010. 1,082, 2,000 gained. You can see it across this map. When we flip to the next and you look at rural America, about half of rural America counties, 47% of rural counties lost population. 2000 to 2010, and we're going to delve into this more at a deeper level in a minute, Adirondack communities saw about a 1.2% population loss. We lost about 1,000 people or so from 2000 to 2010. And we'll get into the particulars of where those losses were, because I think this helps to identify strategies for moving ahead. But when we look at rural America, about half of the counties in rural America are losing population in the short term. So, next please. I'm not going to go deeply into this, just given the time constraints. But the upshot is we reproduce at a lower rate than a lot of other places, especially other rural areas. We tend to track more like the major metropolitan areas in the Adirondacks, with our ratio of children 0 to 14 and our adults of childbearing age. We couldn't do a standard birth rate analysis because the census data is very difficult to work with that as far as trying to break out just 18-year-olds. We couldn't really do that. Sometimes it was even difficult to break apart in all parts of the country the counts for males and females with some of the older census data. So we couldn't do a traditional birth rate analysis. So we just looked at 0 to 14-year-olds and the ratio of 0 to 14-year-olds compared to 20 to 44-year-olds. And you see where the park ends up in 2010. We have just 0.57 children to adult. New York State is at 0.53. The U.S. is at 0.59. We're very similar. We're quite different from other rural areas, which are 0.67 and 0.64. If you do the math, and if we reproduce like these other rural areas, we have another 2,700, 1,800 young people in the park. That would overnight change our school enrollment issues. So it's a sociological question beyond the scope of this report, but there's something happening. If you look at the population across the country, we're part of this landscape of urban areas, 103 million people, even though it's just 17% of U.S. counties with 103 million people. It's the major metropolitan areas across the country. We tend to, for whatever reason, have a reproductive rate like that. Next, please. Our median age is also much higher than other places. We're really an outlier when it comes to the median age for a variety of reasons. One is we experienced the growth that we'll talk about in a minute as part of the baby boom. The baby boom was really a rural population explosion across the country. Rural areas all across the country, although we're just 15% of the population, we have 25% of senior citizens today in rural America. You can see that the park has 45.7 median age in 2010. Not only do we have an older rural population, we also recruit retirees. A lot of other places export their retirees, or a large number. We recruit retirees, so that also adds to it. Interestingly, when you look across the country, just back up for one sec. Yeah, 17%, 1 out of every 6 counties. So oftentimes, median age has been one of the most controversial data points in the park. 1 out of 6 counties, 525, had a median age as old or older than us. Next, please. When you look at rural America, it's 24%. 1 out of every 4 counties in rural America had a median age as old or older than we are. And this gets to some of the population dynamics that we're really going to delve into next. So let's jump into those. School district analysis. This map kind of says it all. We often see a report, such and such a school district in the park has experienced the loss of population or loss of enrollment has dropped by so many students. When you look at school districts and the change over the last 40 years, there's a lot of red on the map. There's a lot of red in particular across upstate New York. There's a lot of red here in the park, but we are not alone as far as our school district and our enrollment trends. New York is an aging state. By 2010, we actually may be getting a little younger because of some immigration trends, but in general, upstate New York, we're seeing a real long-term drop in the size of our school districts. Okay, next for the cohort analysis. This is hard to read, but one of the things we did in the report, and we think this is one of the most interesting things, is we looked at the experiences of different age groups in the park. How did this age group for these 61 park towns differ from other places across the country? And we have our different geographic areas, but all we did is we looked at the number of people who were born in these different age groups. The first 1936 to 1945. This is my parents' age cohort. 1936. You can't, but when we meet them in 1970, they're 25 to 34. They can't reproduce another 25-year-olds. So people are either moving into these geographic areas or people are moving out of these geographic areas. For the U.S., we're either experiencing mortality or we're getting immigration from abroad. That's how these cohorts work. But what's fascinating, we look at the park towns, 1970, they're 25 to 34, they're 9,200 people. By 2010, it's 10,000. Roughly a net gain of 1,000. We grow at 11.6%. Where do we pick up people? We pick up people at age 35. File that away. Think of that. That's going to be a constant theme. We start to pick up people at age 35. And then we pick up retirees. We pick up another 1,000 at age 55. So that's where recruitment happens, and we'll start to see those themes play out. The interesting thing is we gain at 11.6% as New York State. The same age cohort in the state drops by 40%. Over 600,000 people. Over from 2.2 to 1.3. 900,000 New Yorkers in that age group over this 40-year period said, we're going to North Carolina, Texas, California, who knows? But they leave the state. Our growth is similar to other rural areas. We'll start to see some generational differences as far as the desire to live and especially to retire in rural areas. We look at the next age group, 46 to 1955, when this group was born. Again, the park towns, we start to see the baby boom. There's 13,700 of them. By 2010, when we just hit the first of the retirement wave, we're up at 15.9. So we've increased by about 2,000 people. 15.6%. A lot of green for rural America. New York State is still losing 22%. The country as a whole picks up roughly 1 million people from immigration from abroad. But you start to see the park towns, again, recruitment at age 35, and recruitment again at age 55. So this group picks up. Next, please. Everything changes when we get into the Generation X, when we get into the late baby boomers and the Generation X. 56 to 65, this is my age cohort. Park towns start at 19,000. Again, they're younger, they're 5 to 14 years old. When we meet this age group, by 2010, they're 45. The park towns drop about 1,900 people, about a 10% loss. So we do pick up about 1,000 people at age 35. We pick up a few hundred more at age 45. We'll know in 2020 whether this 10% is significantly reduced or eliminated, because then we'll see the influx of retirees at age 55. So we don't know, the story is not yet completely written for this group, but by the limited amount of data that we had, they dropped by 10%. When you look across rural America, as opposed to all the green that was on for rural America in those earlier age groups, we're actually losing population across rural America. So we start to see a shift with people of this age cohort away from rural America, and we're going to see that play out more dramatically with subsequent groups. The U.S. as a whole grows by 4 million. This is fascinating. Immigration from abroad, the U.S. grows by over 4 million people, 10.2%. You look at rural America, drops from 7, we lose 500,000. So the U.S. gains, this age group gains by over 4 million, but yet rural areas have a net loss of 500,000. Immigrants from abroad are not coming to rural America. We look at the Generation Xers, again, big losses. Park towns are 22.5% negative. And you look at all the red across rural America, the country as a whole is growing, adding almost 6 million people from immigration from abroad. We're getting to a younger population, 5 to 14 in 1980, 35 to 44 by 2010. Immigration is very much a young person's game. We see that growth here. For the park towns, we start to see a dominant trend really materialize, and that's the export of roughly 4,500 college-age young people. That's when people leave the park. I have 2 kids in college. They both left the park. We have one 4-year school, Paul Smith's. We have 1 community college in the park. But we start to see significant export of college-age young people, and that will be a dominant trend. Not only is it a dominant trend in the Adirondack, it's a dominant trend across rural America. You know, we've read about college closings. Vermont has lost 3 rural colleges recently. You know, Paul Smith is hanging on, which is great. But you start to see this trend. You also start to see the trickle back at age 35. So we pick up about 1,800 or so people at age 35, but we lost 4,000. So the number of people who come back at age 35 does not begin to replace the number of people who we lost to the export of college-age young people. Even, it'll be interesting to see in 20 years out, we start to pick up 45-year-olds and retirees for the Generation Xers, what happens, whether or not things will even out, or whether or not there will just be a slow population loss. When we get to the next age groups, the millennials and the pre-millennials, this is really just looking at the export of college-age young people. And you see the park towns drop from 13 to 9, 13.7 to 9.8, but you see these losses, 35, 28, 16, 20, 22, 32, big numbers being put up by rural areas in the country as far as the loss of college-age young people. And that's really what we're seeing here. The next one, please. So this is a chart where we can really dig into where we're seeing those population losses in the park. And this is that 1.2% population loss from 2000 to 2010, which I talked about before, dropping from 101,824 to 100,606. Where did we actually experience these losses? 4 different groups. And this chart is in the report. You see that our total combined births, is less than the total combined births in this area. That gets to the low birth rate that we were talking about before. But one thing that's interesting is the number of people that are being born is generally in the same ballpark. Of the 9,000 plus is right around the number of people where we're experiencing either the mortality of older residents or older residents who leave the park to be closer to family, assisted living, that sort of thing. You see the big college age loss. Boom. We lose 4,500 kids in that college age time period. The interesting thing is, when we lose 4,500, we retain 15,000. 15,000 young people of college age chose to either stay here or to move here. What are the career possibilities for this group? They clearly wanted to be here at an early point in their life or to stay here. You also see that we put up positive numbers. They're low, they're nothing like the big numbers that we lost for college age young people, but we put up positive numbers for people in their 30s and 40s who are coming to the park. Several hundred at a time. And then we pick up a big slug of retirees, almost 1,000 retirees. It is in 2000 to 2010, and then we start to experience the effects of older people moving away from the park or mortality. 1.2% loss. If we carried this rate forward, we would lose about 10,000 people between now and 2050. So it's not a huge loss. It's very similar, as I said, half of all counties in rural America are losing population. We can talk about where these 1,200 are. But the other thing to really take away from this is we're talking about relatively small numbers. If you get 100 people a decade to move to the park, we erase that number largely. And it's 50 couples. So are there strategies that we can put in place for recruitment? Can we build upon the self-employment trends? Can we build upon different recruitment strategies? We see Vermont, if you're self-employed, they will pay you to come to the state. Maine is going to start a similar program. Are there things like that we could do for the most rural areas in New York State? Are the things that Adirondack communities and incentives that Adirondack communities could put together for themselves? Does it make sense to spend $25 million on the Frontier Town campground or $25 million into recruiting young people to move to the park? These are decisions to make as far as investments that we're making to build institutions and build strategies for Adirondack communities. It'll be interesting when we get to 2020 to see whether or not this rate is higher, whether this rate is lower, whether we're back in the black as opposed to the red. That will be interesting to see. Some folks have said, well, 2010, Great Recession, a lot of people who were going to retire in 8, 9, 10 said, forget it. It's interesting. If you read the rural economic development, community development literature, there's a whole school of thought coming out of Iowa State about shrink smart. How can we build more vital, vibrant, compelling communities, even as we get smaller? We can build communities with stronger institutions, in some ways with greater amenities, in some ways with a stronger economy, even if we're experiencing a slow population loss. There are others that say we're going to continue this loss because as an older rural community, we're just really seeing it's going to level out to a steady state because we just have this older group, largely of baby boomers, who are aging out. This is a group that very much was interested, showing a greater level of desire to live in rural areas than following age cohorts and generations. So we may see this age through rural America, and we'll get to a steady state plateau. So that really breaks apart what's happening, and I think opens the door for a number of potential strategies. And I think that's it. So some of the takeaways, a lot of these things I've been talking about. We can stop blaming the park. The Adirondack experience is really the experience of rural America. I think we need a better diagnosis of the challenges facing the park than we've seen heretofore from local and state leaders. I think there's opportunities for recruitment of people at different ages that I think bear investigation. If we can get beyond the finger pointing, if we can get beyond it's just the environment and that sort of thing, and really zero in on the challenges facing different communities in the park, I think, hopefully we're providing just some data. We still cling to this quaint notion that, not everything is post-truth and post-fact, that good data will drive public policy. Hopefully that's still alive here in the Adirondacks. And if we can use good data to drive public policy, then we'll feel vindicated by the work. But that's the report. The report that we've written, and it's on the back table, is so much better than this presentation. So I encourage you all to read the report. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take just a few minutes to move these green chairs around. So if you guys want to grab something to drink or use the restroom, we'll be back with our conversation in a few minutes. So Peter's been presenting this information, which was really great, by the way, Peter, thank you. He's been presenting this around the community, and as he does it, the natural questions that he came to at the end come up, and everybody wants to talk about it, and that's what we want to do today. So, and I do think there's a really natural connection with the information that Adam's been gathering as well. So with that, I'll let Brandon start with some questions.
Okay, thank you. Peter, I know you're familiar with about a decade ago, the Adirondack Park Regional Assessment Project, which I think had a different viewpoint. Was supported by the state and local governments. And one thing I found in it was they surveyed local officials in the park, and about half of them found that lack of developable land was, or they blamed that for at least part of their economic woes. And I'm just wondering if you think they're wrong, or what's your take on 10 years later, what they said?
Yeah, I mean, the APRAP report was interesting, and it was controversial. It really focused on, in large part, on different things than what we focused on. They did great inventories of the capacity of sewage and water systems and the number of members of volunteer fire companies, and the pretty good school district analysis and that sort of stuff. They looked at population trends, largely focusing in on median age, but and it was very similar to what we found. They didn't look at any of the economic data at all. That's not
income and
in the APRAP report. So that's not something that they focused on. It was really trying to look at community readiness and that sort of thing. As far as developable land, you know, it really depends community by community. Affordable housing is different community by community across the park. You know, there's lots of affordable housing in Thurman, in Stony Creek, in Indian Lake, in places like that. It's tighter, clearly, in Harrietstown and North Elba and Keene and places like that. So these impacts are different. And one of the things that people have criticized our report for is that we didn't focus enough on particular towns. You know, what's happening in one town versus another, which would be interesting. It would be a lot of work, and it would make this report 400 pages, and nobody would read it. But you know, I don't. You know, when you look, one of the things we're also looking at now is we're updating a study on development in the park that the RCPA did back in the 1990s, and we're starting to look at building permits town by town. There's a ton of building permits being issued at the local government level. So if there's a concern about the amount of developable land that's not being translated into building permits, which continue to go up year over year. There's more building permits being issued by local government 2000 to 2010 than there were in the 1990s. And we're carrying that forward to 2019.
Okay. One of the arguments I've heard from people who do blame the park, I suppose is what you'd say, is that if a business has the opportunity to locate inside the park or outside the park, or just outside the park, if that's the deciding factor, they would likely go outside the park. I don't know in your experience if that's true. It looks like in your data on income that the split towns did have more growth in income, and I don't know if you've looked at why that is, and if you can respond to that question of whether the lack of regulation just outside the line draws more.
I think it's the bigger population centers right outside the line. When one of the things in the composition of split towns, and Colton in St. Lawrence County is a split town. I think the economic activity in North Elba is much more dynamic than the economic activity in Colton in St. Lawrence County, or Diana, or any of the Lewis County towns, Croghan, Watson, that sort of thing. When you get down into the Saratoga County towns, which are all pretty highfalutin bedroom communities for Saratoga Springs, and Saratoga is the fastest growing county upstate, and you look at what's happened in Queensbury over this time period. I mean, Queensbury has grown in a major way over, from the end of World War II to where it is now, had the population increase fivefold. But I think it's really the proximity of some of the split towns to major population centers of Saratoga, primarily of Saratoga and Glens Falls, with Queensbury added in, and to some extent Plattsburgh as well. That's where we see. If we carved out all of those towns and just did a separate analysis of sort of the small city influence split towns, I think it would be a very different story.
So it's more in your view, it's more the location of those and what those communities are than the regulation.
Right, and as far as small manufacturing, there was a big issue years ago where a plywood factory went to Whitehall instead of locating in the Adirondack Park. But now, you see the small manufacturing that has been able to persist in the park, and small manufacturing has changed dramatically across rural America. It's one of the rural America stories, is the loss of small manufacturing. You look at a place like Tupper Lake Hardwoods, very successful. They've wanted to expand for years. They can't find the labor force to do it, and they ended up having to automate. Regrettably, they rather than putting that money into personnel, they put that money into machines. That also is a story of small manufacturing in rural America, largely because of labor supply issues, which opens up a whole other story about rural America, employment readiness, and that sort of thing. Certainly beyond the scope of this report.
Well, let's go into that a little bit. Adam, I think before we came up here, you were talking about labor issues with manufacturing and not being able to find people to work in. And I don't know where you meant, but in the park.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the biggest issues mentioned by just about everyone I spoke to. Economic development and skills training across the region. I think employers and regional planners are waking up to the fact that they're not going to survive if they don't have skilled workforce from Adirondack communities. And right now, you know, unemployment is historically low. I spent a fair bit of time actually looking at what's happening in Plattsburgh and the needs of employers there. I spoke with a staffing and recruiting agency there. On any given day, they've got between 130 and 150 relatively well-paying jobs that employers are looking to fill. And similar in the Glens Falls region. At the same time, you've got people complaining that, or not complaining, but looking for meaningful work. So I think one of the challenges that the region faces is how do we bridge that gap? Large numbers of unemployed youth between the ages of 16 and 24. We need to figure out how to train these individuals, and there are a lot of programs that are seeking to do that now. I mean, Clinton Community College has a remarkable advanced manufacturing institute that, you know, was funded through the state, something like a $12 million grant, and they're actively working to train high school grads and older adults who are unemployed and looking for work. And as with most of these issues, you know, they touch on so many aspects of life in the region. Obviously, not everyone has transportation, so if you need to get to Plattsburgh to work, you have to figure that out. And there are some efforts to work on things like that. One of the largest manufacturers in Plattsburgh, Mold-Right Plastics, employs over 500 individuals. They actually contract with Franklin County Public Transportation to operate a bus from Malone every day that coincides with the beginning of the shift in the morning and the end of the shift later in the afternoon. And that's been enormously successful, probably 100 rides a week. So the jobs are, I think, available, but they're spread out, and the park and its communities need to work on training individuals and getting them to where the jobs are.
And it's been interesting, the calls I received after this report came out. The hospital in Saranac Lake has a dozen openings, really well-paid jobs, people highly skilled. They're having a challenging time trying to fill. Hamilton County, has a half dozen sort of career track positions, good benefits, civil service positions that have been open for a long time that they can't fill. So one of the things we talk about in our report is there's some way to put together some type of clearinghouse that talks about what career opportunities there are in the park and enumerates and lists and provides information about those, and and tries to get that information to people who are either in the park and trying to figure out what their career path is going to be, or are people who are outside the park and want to move here. But also building. When I talked about the 15,000, that population of 15,000 people that each decade that are young people who choose to stay here or move here, that's also a population that we clearly have to focus on as far as making sure they're career track positions that they can make a good life here in the Adirondacks. And those are going to touch on a number of things that Adam was talking about. But I think purposeful, deliberative, active programming that focuses on these things for a small area like the park would be enormously beneficial.
Is it fair to say that the takeaway from your report is basically that we're not out of line with the rest of rural America? In some ways we're better. Income, I think, is one of them. In some ways not as well. I don't know if maybe you'd say in the middle in terms of like population retention of young people. So the population is maybe not quite as good as the income.
Right.
Piece. And Adam, are you finding that we're similarly aligned with rural America on other issues, opioids, other things that rural America generally is experiencing?
I think by and large, yeah, I did look at the opioid issue and substance abuse disorder more broadly. I think that the region has been somewhat behind the curve on dealing with the opioid issue, and providing access to treatment and recovery, but that's starting to change dramatically now, and there's a lot of interesting work being done. Although it is, again, spread out, so not all parts of the park are going to have the same kind of access to treatment and recovery. But I think that, you know, park or no park, you know, we're part of rural America, and this is a conversation that's happening, you know, nationwide. And yeah, we're confronting the same challenges, the same issues. But I do think that Peter's right to point out that, you know, in many ways we are doing better. And I think one other point to add to that is that there's a lot to learn from other rural communities across the country. I think sometimes we tend to look at the Adirondacks as unique. It is unique, but as somehow apart from the rest of the country. And there's a lot happening in different rural communities that we can learn from. I mean, Vermont, which is where I live now, for example, has a number of innovative programs that have been around for a long time that I looked at in my research that I think we could learn from. You know, they have a home share program that pairs older adults with younger folks who may need some kind of rent subsidy, and in exchange for labor or companionship or whatever, they make that work. And they've been around since 1984, long before the so-called sharing economy and Airbnb, and they actually I mean, they've been so successful that they are now a nonprofit, and the model is catching on in other places. And it's works in rural communities, and I think that you got to talk to the people on the ground and learn from them. There's an enormous amount of institutional knowledge and experience here in the park, in the region, among the nonprofits and service providers, and they really do know what these communities need and how to address many of these problems.
In looking at some of the demographic literature that's out there, and an abundance of it, there's sort of two themes emerge, and one is just, you know, this concentration in suburban and metropolitan America of jobs. There's a high percentage of jobs there than the percentage of Americans there. You know, something like, you know, if you look at all the people with college degrees and advanced degrees, you know, overwhelmingly those people are located in metropolitan America. You know, the economic activity, all that. And then, but then you look at, you know, nationally, you know, America used to be this place where, you know, people were mobile, people moved. Well, only young people are moving now. Older people, you know, over age 35, they're not moving. So Americans have really stopped moving in the large numbers that were historically there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and a lot of theories about that. But one of the things that emerges is, what is it when someone does move? Why do they move? And one of the things that comes up is people they're looking for places where they want to go, and it's a job or doing it for financial reasons has actually fallen significantly lower on the scale. It used to be the top one. I moved to Texas for a job. That's why I went there. Now it's like fourth or fifth down the list. But, you know, amenities, scenic and beautiful amenities, you know, cultural amenities are all much higher now. And so people are really looking for communities, which I think, you know, creates a lot of opportunities for the Adirondacks. We have incredible scenic beauty. We have some really dynamic communities with a great array of arts and cultural institutions and restaurants and coffee shops and music and that sort of thing. We certainly, some communities have a lot more of that than other communities, but trying to build that dynamism, I think, you know, makes it attractive for people who grew up here, want to come back, for people who who grew up here and choose to stay, for people who want to move here, because it's not just the economics that are driving the decisions at this point in time.
Adam, when you see these numbers that about basically the 20-year-old cohort being not absent but moving away in larger numbers, what does that tell you? Or what do you see on the ground that suggests that there's something here for them if they were to stay, or what would they need in order to make a life here?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a question that, I mean, all rural communities face. It's not unique to the Adirondack region. You know, I think what Peter was just alluding to, that we need to create the kinds of communities and places that are going to attract younger adults and families who may want to move to a place like the Adirondacks for reasons other than work. I do think that there are a lot of, I mean, one of in the report I looked closely at, you know, unemployment and workforce training, and the young people who do choose to stay, you know, need to be able to find meaningful work and create meaningful lives, and I think that will create the kinds of places that will attract people from perhaps other areas. But it's a tough question. I mean, you know, it's still geographically somewhat isolated, and not everyone wants to live in a place like that today. So, you know, in creating incentives, again, Vermont has tried to do this to some extent. It's been controversial because the state is seen as, you know, investing in bringing in out-of-state, you know, relatively affluent young folks, and perhaps not investing in local youth and residents. So these programs are complicated, but they need to be explored. And I think we obviously need to do everything we can to attract young families to the region.
Do either of you have a theory about why our birth rate is what it is, that it's lower, that if we're acting more like the metro areas, why would that be? Is there something in the economic data that suggests why that should be?
Well, I mean, historically, birth rates have been lower with a variety of factors. You're seeing this in major industrialized economies. You know, the birth rate is negative in Germany and Japan, places that where there are greater opportunities for employment and education of women, the birth rates go down. So it's generally, as you know, affluence goes up, birth rates go down. And you see that in metropolitan areas. It could be that our population of those 20 to 44-year-olds are older. There's more of the 35 to 44-year-olds than there are the 20 to 30-year-olds. But we're in line with New York State and the U.S., but we're different than other rural areas. And you know, we're also in some ways, you know, wealthier than other rural areas. I think there's a connection.
Okay. Also, the self-employment, do you think that's a factor? The types of jobs, I guess, that there are here?
I mean, you know, the American family is very different. I mean, I know very few people who have, I mean, you know, I know a lot of people of my age group in my cohort with one child. I know a lot who had no kids. You know, a bunch with two. There's very few with more than two. I mean, it seems like most people, I mean, of my friends, you know, in Hamilton County and around the park, it's one or two. Those that had kids, it's one or two kids.
Older professionals are moving here. Why is that? What is here to support them, and what do you think there needs to be here to support them?
Well, I think it becomes a lifestyle choice, and they figured out how to either they've been able to get a job that is worth moving here for, or they've figured out how to bring their job with them, or they've have resources to invest, and they either grew up here and wanted to come back, or they've, you know, had a family second home and they've always thought about living in the park, or you know, they discovered the Adirondacks and wanted to live here. I think, you know, there's a number of things. You know, good survey data of these people would be really fascinating to find out what is it that made them want to come to the park and move here. That would be fascinating. You know, that data doesn't exist right now. So we're just theorizing about why that may be. But I think the amenities of the park, clearly, a lot of the people that retire here, and I've known a number of these folks over the years, they were great volunteers at different organizations I worked at, and they would ski all morning and stuff envelopes all afternoon, and they were here for 20 or 25 years before they could no longer hike and ski and canoe and that sort of thing, but they were very active, many days a week in enjoying the outdoors.